We're glad to have you back. According to the National Bureau of Statistics, Nigeria's monthly inflation rate rose to 28.2% in November from 27.3% in the previous month. The Statistics Office said the November 2023 headline inflation rate showed an increase of 0.87% points when compared to October 2023's headline inflation figures. According to the report, the food inflation in November quickened to 32.84% year-on-year compared to the rate recorded in November 2022 at 24.13%. Now, what does this mean for the economy? What does it mean for the man on the streets? Yes, that's where we'll start from today. And I have the right person joining me live from Owerri in Imo State, the Chief Executive Officer and founder of Cowrie Assets Management Limited, Mr. Johnson Chukwu. Good afternoon, compliments of the season. It's good to see you.
Good afternoon, Tulu. Thank you for having me.
All right. I want to start, like I said in my introduction. What does this really mean for the man on the street? Is this figure, 28.20%? What does it mean for my 1,000 naira? What does it mean for my 5,000 naira I have in the bank?
Okay, Tolu, what it means is that for an average household, any product you used to buy for 100 naira in November last year, you now need to spend 128 naira, 20 kobo to buy it. Which means, in effect, if your income has not increased over that 1 year period, then your standard of living or your cost of living has increased by 28.2%, or your standard of living has been devalued by that same percentage. So that is what it means. And that is why it is hurting to most households in the country. Because the reality is that most households have not seen that level of increase in their earnings, particularly those on paid employment. And if you don't have a commensurate increase in your earnings, then your standard of living will deteriorate because you can only afford just about 72% of what you used to afford, or 71% of what you used to afford by this time last year.
That speaks to it. Food inflation at 32.84%. The challenges almost remain the same. Insecurity, farmers can't get to the farms. We have issues with storage facilities, infrastructure. How do we move the produce from the farm to from the rural to the urban areas where we get to sell them? Diesel is on the high side at the moment. Please take us through why we still have this figure at this point and what can be done to address it, medium, short term, maybe, of course, long term.
Yeah, Tolu, the challenge we have with food inflation is fundamental to, or is directly related to insecurity in the country. We've seen insecurity in the country worsen. And remember, because our food production is still largely peasant farming or subsistence farming. So when you have displaced of farmers from their farming localities and they are now living in internally displaced persons camps, then you are certainly going to see a reduction in food production. And that's one of the key pressures we're having, that we are dealing with heightened level of insecurity that has displaced farmers from their farming zones into IDPs. And until we reverse that, you are not going to see an improvement in food prices, because currently we're not able to produce as much quantity of food as we used to produce, so as to bring down inflation. You have mentioned some other constraints that even whatever is produced, we still have a high rate of losses at the farm gate. That means farmers, when they produce perishable food items, they are not able to evacuate them to the markets where they are consumed or demanded. So you still have that level of losses. Of course, that is coming from multiple reasons. One, we don't have storage facilities. Two, we don't have proper efficient transport system. So all these things are constraining food production or food production, and that's why you see dealing with the rate of food inflation about 32.84% in the month of November. And if you add that, if you consider the fact that food inflation was about 24% the preceding November, then that means for the past 2 years, an average household cost of food has increased by about 57%. So if your income has not increased between November 2021 and November 2023, which is a period of 2 years, then what you spend on food has increased by 57%. It then means that you can only afford barely half of the quantity of food that you could afford 2 years ago. And that, I keep saying that is where Nigerians are hurting. Because if you have a situation where population is increasing, and then the cost of food over the past 2 years has increased by more than 57%, most households have not seen an increase in their income, then you can also recognize that if you look at the household consumption pattern in the country, a predominant consumption in the average household in the country is food. So that's the largest component of our consumer price index. And that is what is hurting. And that's what, when Nigerians cannot afford to feed, then you can imagine the impact on their standard of living.
Improving productivity in the agricultural space, very important. We've seen the likes of schemes before now, and the most recent one is the Anchor Borrower scheme and all. Because to improve production, I think there will need to be improved funding. There will need to be infrastructure in place and all of that. So what sort of partnerships should we be looking at moving forward in 2024 to actually take us away from where we are to where we should be, about 50–60%? With the land that we have, we should be able to address this anomaly.
Yes, Tolu, we've been on it for God knows how long, 20 years. And it looks like an impossibility, but it's not rocket science to become a productive economy. Let me just highlight some of the critical things we need to do as a country. One, we need to build infrastructure that will support productive activities, one of which is transport infrastructure. The other one is energy infrastructure. Without energy infrastructure, you're going to have difficulties having effective storage facilities, particularly close to the farm gates. So even the rural areas, you have stable power supply. So you can have silos, you can also have refrigeration centers where you can refrigerate, particularly the perishable food items, until they're evacuated to where they are demanded. So that's one factor. The other factor we have to look at is that our Land Use Act, that we need to now review that so that we can actually create commercial land that will allow commercial agricultural activities to continue to take place. The third factor is issue of insecurity. I know a couple of people who actually have commercial land, commercial agricultural outlets in places like Edo State. They can't get to their farm because of fear of being kidnapped. So we need to address the issue of insecurity in the country. You need to address the issue of supporting infrastructure for the agricultural sector. For instance, irrigation. If you have irrigation in several parts of the country, you're likely going to have two-season farming, particularly for some cereals like rice, where you can actually have the upland rice and the paddy rice. And most localities in the country can have sufficient weather to have two-season rice farming. So you're going to have improvement in productivity of each cultivated hectare of land that will be comparable to what happens elsewhere in the world. And then you look at access to funding. You did mention Anchor Borrowers Program. We need to go beyond that. We need to have a scheme that will provide financial support to even directly to the peasants, and also help them to form some level of formalization, either bring them into cooperatives or bring them to have joint venture businesses with their colleagues, so you can have incorporation of this interest. And that way you're going to have a more enduring businesses. You can actually have structures that will make it easy for you to lend. So if we place some of these I mentioned, we will begin to see a reversal in our food production, and possibly the agriculture sector will actually begin to really account for about 29% of the GDP, which it currently accounts for. But in terms of impact, we're not seeing that. We saw a sector that largely had been growing at close to just barely 1.3% year on year, when you consider the fact that it accounts for almost a third of the GDP. If that sector is growing by about 6%, 7%, the Nigerian GDP will be growing at least a minimum of 4–5%.
Before we look at what inflation might be, because some say, or some analysts say, we might continue at this pace till maybe first, second quarter next year. But I want to also ask that our dependence on imports is what someone analysts are saying that is also the reason why inflation continues to go higher. But my question really will be, if another shipment is expected at Dangote Refinery, that's the second one, and also Port Harcourt Refinery, we hear a segment of it should get working anytime soon. But my question really is, if we start to refine in country and reduce these effects that we use to import PMS largely, do you think that there will be any shift, talking about the strength in our currency?
Well, it should, but I have to put a caveat. Of course, currently, if you look at the foreign trade report, importation of fuel and diesel and ATK accounted for close to 28% of our total imports. So that then means that if you are able to domesticate the refining of these products, you are going to save about 28% of your current demand for FX. But the caveat remains that the Port Harcourt refinery mentioned has actually passed its useful life. And I still have my strong doubt that Port Harcourt refinery will never become an efficient refining outlet in the country. Because when you talk about efficient, you're saying the liters, the products refined per barrel of crude in terms of quantity of the refined product or the white products will be commensurate with what any other refinery in the world will produce from a barrel of crude. So if you don't achieve that, you're going to be sub-optimizing and you're actually going to be losing money. And I remember one of the former ministers of petroleum resources for state, Dr. Ibekachukwu, did say that the value we extract from refining a barrel of crude is less than the cost of a barrel of crude. And therefore, it didn't make sense to continue to refine. So we need to deal with that. And the solution would be we need to encourage more domestic refineries. Then on Dangote refinery, if Dangote is able to produce enough to supply the local demand, then you're going to see where the FX pressure the FX that we paid for it will be domesticated in a Nigerian entity. And what do I mean by domesticated in a Nigerian entity? Remember that Dangote refinery will need to buy crude in dollars. And if Dangote buys crude in dollars, Dangote will have to sell refined petroleum product in dollars. If it doesn't sell in dollars, then it won't be able to meet its obligation to those who are crude suppliers to it. So, and if Nigeria decides to supply the crude to Dangote refinery, and Dangote refinery is a 650,000 barrel refinery per day, currently what is Nigeria producing? Nigeria, for the first 9 months of this year, produced just about 1.33 million barrels of crude. So if Nigeria supplies the entire 650,000 barrels to Dangote in Naira, Nigeria will not have any earnings in dollar to meet other import obligations. And that will be calamitous because it simply means we will never be able to meet interest payments on our foreign loans. And I don't think that is a feasible thing. Remember also that the crude we have does not belong to the NNPC alone. Yes, there's what we call domestic crude obligation, but domestic crude obligation is not as high as 650,000 barrels. Even at that, the domestic crude obligation is supposed to be based on the volume of crude produced by each of the international oil companies. In the present situation where they're not able to produce enough, then their domestic crude obligation is minimal. So those are the issues we have to deal with. It looks like Dangote refinery is a silver bullet to resolve all our related problems as it relates to importation and refined petroleum products. But there are also challenges we must recognize are associated with the fact that crude is traded in dollars and Nigeria is not even producing enough. If we're producing 3 million barrels a day and we are allocating 650,000 barrels to Dangote, it won't be a problem.
I like that point. It wouldn't be, and there's still issues around oil theft and all of that on the other side. Well, despite all of these challenges, projections and reprojections from World Bank, from IMF, just yesterday, an economist says growth will be about 3.3% GDP in 2024. My earlier guest also agreed that there will be a slight kind of. What is your outlook moving on?
Well, so we've always had forecasts that are quite optimistic. For this year, I think IMF World Bank has been forecasting about 3.2% growth of the Nigerian GDP. The first quarter of this year, we only grew by 2.31%. Second quarter, we grew by 2.51%. And third quarter, we grew by 2.54%. So if you look at the 3 quarters, then you clearly will accept that the projection the IMF had made for this year looks like a mirage. And the issues that will determine how quickly or how fast the Nigerian GDP will grow in 2024 are the issues we are discussing now. Issues of insecurity. If you don't address insecurity, growth rate will still remain poor. Like I did mention, 29% of the GDP is accounted by agriculture. It grew by 1.3%. So that is not material growth. And look at one of the strongest growth sectors, which is financial services industry. It accounts for less than 5% of the GDP. The one that grew about 28%. Telecommunication that accounts for about 15.9% of the GDP, grew by 6.6%. And that sector is beginning to encounter challenges as it relates to the regulatory environment, issue of insecurity, where sometimes the criminals, as I may call them, whatever they claim they are, we breach telecommunication infrastructure to make sure there's no communication around that point. So we need to address the issues that are militating against economic growth before we can begin to hazard a guess of a 3.3% growth in 2024.
I must thank you so much, Founder, Chief Executive Officer, Cowrie Assets Management Limited, Mr. Justin Chukwu. Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year in advance again to you.
Thank you for having me, and Merry Christmas to you and all the viewers.
Thank you so much out there. Well, let's get to markets.